So I'm very excited to be here. Thanks, Matt. It's really exciting in two ways. Just talking about World Cup, what it means, and it's very exciting because it means a lot to my company. So I'm one of the co-founders, and I'm the CEO of a company called Peer5. We do a lot of streaming. We have a peer-to-peer mesh network that is based on WebRTC. And the World Cup is just a huge event that allows us to add a lot of value to customers. It's an event where so many people come to watch football or soccer, how you want to call it, and it creates just huge peaks that we're able to help. So we work with companies like Fubo TV, and we work with broadcasters like RTP, which is the national broadcaster of Portugal, and work with various telcos as well. And all of them are streaming the World Cup, and I'm going to share some of the data that we have. It's all going to be anonymized. It's all very new, so forgive me, it's a little bit a mess, but I'll try to tell you a good story about it. So first of all, let's try to put things in context. I don't know how many of you actually watch the World Cup, but it's a pretty big deal. So if you compare it to the Super Bowl, it's not only one game, it's 64 games, and each of them is at least as big as the Super Bowl. The finals is at least 10 times bigger than the Super Bowl. Some countries consider it as their religion, not the World Cup, but football in general. And even though it's not a big deal in the US, some parts, like we work out of the mission, and it's a big deal in the mission, especially when Mexico are proceeding to the next stage. So now, to all of you that don't know, the first group phase is finished. Now we're going to the round of 16, and it's a good time kind of like to summarize it and see what happened so far. So a couple of weeks ago, I had a little debate. I wrote a blog post, and in the blog post, I said that I think the World Cup is going to be the biggest event of all times. And it seems to be a bit controversial. Dan Rayburn, I don't know if you guys know him. He's a streaming media expert / analyst recognized by many as the voice of F. And he wrote, "It won't beat the records that League of Legends continues to set. 24 million simultaneous is the number to beat. And who knows, right?" So just to TLDR, there is no real winner at this point. But let me give you some interesting numbers. So streaming the World Cup, this is actually a really interesting Wikipedia article that just lists hundreds of broadcasters worldwide that most of them actually streaming the games this year. So as opposed to 4 years ago, this year, almost every broadcaster that bought the rights for streaming the World Cup is doing it also over the internet. We talk about 100 countries. Each one of them has usually 2 or 3 broadcasters. One example is the BBC. So the BBC in England has the rights. When England beat Tunisia just a week ago, they had 3 million concurrent viewers just on that single broadcaster just for England. And that was the highest ever live audience for the iPlayer ever. Another interesting key data, in my opinion, is from Conviva. So Conviva measure video analytics. Back in 2010, they reported 1.5 million concurrent for the World Cup. 4 years later, 3.2. This year, they're talking about 7.7 peak concurrent views just for one game between Argentina and Iceland. Not necessarily the most interesting game, but until now, a pretty good game. And that's aggregated across, I guess, their broadcasters. So I did a little bit of a guesstimation here, so bear with me. Let's say Conviva market share is about 15%, and I asked a few people around here. Some of them said, sounds a little bit low, sounds a bit high, so I feel pretty good right now about it. And I did this extrapolation, which is very sophisticated. I just divided by 15%, and got to the number of 51 million concurrent viewers that I feel pretty confident about it. I think even if it's maybe a little bit off, it's not by far. So there you go, Dan Rayburn. But the sad news is that TV is still kicking streaming in the butt. So we all work on different aspects of streaming here. We all want streaming to be better, either from the vendor side or from the broadcaster side. But I think we can all agree that as a viewer, going to the television is a pretty safe bet. You can watch. There's not going to be any rebuffering, no ABR rendition switches. It just works, right? And these days, even in 4K, many broadcasters have 4K. But there is some room for optimism. We're getting better at streaming the World Cup, not just Peer 5, but in general. And I think in the US, there's one interesting anecdote. So one broadcaster that did the World Cup 4 years ago was ESPN. And they use CDNs. They are not amateurs. They knew what they're doing, but they failed very bad. So it completely failed for most of their users when the US played. It was a large game, and they admitted, look, there were too many viewers. We couldn't sustain it, and we failed. This year, there are at least 6 solid OTT providers. So you have Hulu, you have Sling, you have DirecTV, you have Fubo that works with us. You can watch it directly from Fox. And so far, I think the user experience is pretty good. But I'm going to ask you a question back. Who knows who's streaming the World Cup this year in 4K? No one? So the correct answer is the BBC iPlayer. Feel proud over there, right? So the BBC iPlayer was brave enough to do that. So, streaming 4K HDR actually, which I think is like 4 times more bits per stream compared to 1080, which I think it's great. It's great for the industry. Even if they fail, it's good that they try. So interestingly, today, just about 8 hours ago, Trusted Reviews published something very interesting about that. After they saw some complaints about users saying it didn't work that well, they actually created a professional survey, which I'm not aware of similar surveys, so I was excited about. They actually asked more than 1,000 viewers that stream the games, and 65% of them said worked really well. 35% said they experienced issues. So I think it's a good start, but still far, far from the television quality, far from what we want, far from what end users today expect from high-quality sports stream. And they can get really upset when their favorite team is not shown in higher quality or rebuffer, God forbid. Another question to you. What broadcaster from Australia is streaming the World Cup this year? Optus. Right. Good answer. So number 3. Depends on the state of the packager and the encoder on that day. So a few games were streamed on Optus. Then on one of the Australian games, it completely shut down. The Prime Minister had to go and review what they did. He watched Nick on some of the Demusk talks, tried to understand how to build video infrastructure, but that didn't work. So they had to give away the rights. After they paid millions for the rights, they gave it to SBS, which I don't think anything like that happened before. They had to, at least for 2 days, exclusive rights. They had to give it away to SBS, who actually streamed the games, as far as I know, pretty well. So their CEO actually, after the Prime Minister interfered, he said the company had identified an issue between the encoder and the packager. And I know there were some rumors and some discussions on the video dev channel. So he said basically here that it affected one of their CDNs, and it was a critical failure, and they're really, really, really sorry. So why is live streaming still so hard? I mean, we're seeing Netflix is doing a great job. YouTube is working very well. Why live streaming is that hard? And I think in the World Cup, it's obvious that the internet does not perform as well as it does on normal cases at peaks. So whenever you have millions of concurrent viewers, you're starting to see issues. ISPs, peering points, and CDNs get congested. And some regions are extremely problematic. So US is relatively a well-connected country. So let's say points of presence of Akamai shuts down. They can get around those problems usually pretty well. But if something similar happens in Australia, Thailand, Brazil, it's harder. Like the network is not as good, there's less capacity, and that's where we see problems. And in these countries, they like football. So, and the third point is it's hard to expect how many viewers you're going to see. So you're launching a new OTT service. You don't know exactly how many people are going to watch, especially when your the revenues are coming from ads and you're not charging money for subscription. Who knows how many people are going to watch the game? And again, in TV, it doesn't matter, right? If you have an extra 1 million, it will work the same. The other point is that, I mean, people are becoming better at scaling their own backends. Their encoding, their DRM systems. They can scale pretty well by spinning more, let's say, AWS instances. But at some point, at certain peak, it's out of your control. So you're using 2 CDNs, 3 CDNs, but it's like a black box. They have fixed capacity. Sometimes they rely on the same shared resources, like a peering point between Optus and the CDN or things like that. So you don't know. You don't know at what point that CDN is going to get congested, what other broadcasters use that same infrastructure. And the fifth point is that you can't really test in advance. And even if you test, it can change during the game because the internet is going crazy during that time. So, things you can do today. You should definitely use multi-CDN, use more than one CDN. Evaluate peer-to-peer, please. If you're a telco, you can go and try ISP caching as well. So many telcos are deploying that, and that helps as well. Use data. So I think one of the points that we discovered that is important is to try to detect problems early on. If you're running a smaller event and you see issues, then the bigger event is not going to work that well too, right? So try to go to Max, Conviva, Ubora, build your own software. Measure rebuffering, measure quality, measure abandonment of users, and see if the CDNs and all the infrastructure that you use are actually performing as you expect. Test and again, test. So stress testing, that was a question I asked on the Slack for video dev, and I got an interesting suggestion to look at Facebook talk about it, how they test at scale. So I think it's an interesting approach. It's not as distributed as we want, and still, if you are going to do it for your CDN, it's going to be expensive because the CDN is going to bill you for all those requests that you're generating. Obviously, unit test, any change you make for your infrastructure, test before you release. And also, you know your limits. So if you're now streaming to 100,000 concurrent viewers, don't expect to have a 10 million concurrent viewers event the day after successful. It's hard. So gradually increase the size that you're going after. I wrote a little bit more tips on the Purify blog. Please check it out. And now I'm going to drill a little bit to data that we see. So I saw a cool infographic from Max about how a World Cup game looks, and we look at it too, and it looks a little bit like Torres del Paine, if you know, like those huge granite rocks. So in this case, this is 4 games, and highlighted here is the same game between Argentina and Iceland. That was a big deal. By the way, fun fact, 98% of Iceland population watched that game, which is insane. And then one footballer said, the other 2% was on the field. So in this game, we reached 77% of loading. So this is how we measure that. Basically, when traffic ramps up, we're getting more affected. We can connect different end users that watch the same content at the same time, and they can help each other. And that's where we're becoming more and more effective, and we can offload the majority of the bits from the broadcaster. And you can see like how even between games, the traffic is relatively high compared to just an average normal day. But you can see like the pre-game show versus the peak is like 4 times bigger. So it's different than VOD, that it's relatively steady. You can see sometimes 10, 20x times peaks than average time, which makes provisioning so hard. Especially if you're a telco, maybe we can talk about it for a sec. So we're working with a Thai telco. They need to provision those games. So they need to plan how many boxes they're going to ship. And it's very hard to provision 10 times more than what you need on average. Just doesn't justify it. So they can use us to elastically scale. So they can provision just for the average case. And we can increase their capacity 5x and even 10x at some times. So this is how it looks on our end. If I'm going to zoom to a single game, so the famous two, like first half, second half, you can see how during the usually what we see, I don't know how it is for Max, the second half is bigger, and the peak is just before the end of the game. It's interesting to see it. So some people just watch the end of the game, and that's fun for them. Who knows? So this is an example. The graph on the left bottom is the playtime versus rebuffering. You can barely see rebuffering in this case. So average of 0.6% rebuffer, and for us it's total duration spent in rebuffering versus playtime. And to drill down more into that, when you're using a homebrew CDN, you're going to see, if you're not provisioning enough, you're going to see a lot of rebuffering. So for example, in this case, I think it's somewhere around 14% rebuffering. So everything works pretty okay, pretty good, and then at the peak, you hit that spot where you don't have enough capacity, and tons of rebuffering to your end users. I think premium broadcasters today aim for less than 1% rebuffering. So definitely, if it's more than 10, it's not watchable. So most of the users will abandon at that time. And data that we see on broadcasters that use one commercial CDN is pretty good. Every 2 to 3 games, you can see a small hiccup in rebuffering, sometimes a bit bigger. In this case, just at the ramp-up time, I don't know exactly what happened, but they reached 7% rebuffering. Then it went down to just perfect. And for like really good high-end broadcasters that use multi-CDN, rebuffering is rarely above 1%, and definitely not 10%. And at that point, it's more interesting to look at rendition switch down. So imagine you're watching at 1080p, then you're switching down to say 720, or more interesting, even like the average bitrate that we see is around 720, and then you see switch down to 480, which is definitely noticeable, and some users abandon because of that. So I think the industry is moving a little bit from rebuffering metrics, which is kind of like for the lower end of the broadcasters, to tracking really the every little piece of rendition switches, the average bit rates, obviously, and we can see that. So just to sum up in terms of what we do for those companies, so by offloading 80% of the traffic at peak, we give them that extra capacity, especially if they're working out of tough geographies that don't have that capacity. And by doing that, we're improving the user experience, we're avoiding rebuffering in many cases, and getting to higher average bit rates. That's it. Thank you. So we don't add any delay basically so everybody are using Dash or HLS. So basically the player has that buffer, right? So we piggyback that buffer. If we're fast enough to basically fetch content from another end user buffer, we're doing that. If not, we're doing a fallback and basically using the CDN. But the playlist is going to be fetched in the beginning of the session exactly as it's fetched today without Peer5. And then the first segment that is going to be requested is also the same segment. So that dictates actually the end-to-end latency. So we don't change that part. Yeah, no good answer here. That's why I asked on the forum. We gradually, we had the Champions League finals just 3 weeks before that, also very, very big, and we felt comfortable. We did some provisioning of extra provisioning of trackers and different parts of our backend to be prepared. But the Champions League volume finals is also huge, so it's not orders of magnitude different. Yeah, so you can verify the streams, basically using hash, the cryptographic hash function, and you can calculate that you're actually receiving the segment that the server created. Yeah. So every segment. So let's say you're using 2-second segments. We will split that segment to small chunks, and we can reconstruct a segment from 20 peers sometimes and the server at the same time. No, we're doing mobile. We're doing like set-top boxes. So for web, we're using JavaScript, obviously, and it's very, very easy. For native devices, we have a native SDK. Yeah, so it's part of an SDK. So everybody builds today. So Fubo, for instance, they have 10 different apps, right? And they ship it to different platforms, and we're just an SDK bundled in that app. So in short, when an end user joins a stream, we would connect him immediately with the 15 best peers that we identified for that particular user based on location, availability, region, ISP, but bunch of parameters that we find effective. And from that moment, that peer is going to communicate independently with those users and exchange metadata and information about the network. Right, so that average size is dictated by the playlist and the segment size. So we see a lot of 4-second segments, kind of like the trade-off between the people that try very low delay versus quality. So I would say like 4 seconds and 3 segments in the playlist. So 12 seconds, sometimes a little bit more. HTML5. WebRTC is now part of HTML5. So for all of you who didn't know, Safari 11 and I think 12 is already out as well. They have WebRTC as part of their official package. So that means WebRTC exists in obviously Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Opera, and Edge, which is still shaky, but basically all browsers supports WebRTC. Thank you.